Centuries of bloodshed, rebellion and betrayal, all centred around a Welsh castle that most people have never even heard of. Initially built by the English to crush the Welsh, Denbigh Castle was seized in a bloody uprising before it was even finished. And what came next was generations of conflict, with this fortress at the centre of sieges, executions, disease and starvation. Prisoners rotted in its dank dungeon cells. Townsfolk endured through absolute misery while trapped inside its walls. And with so much turmoil, it's no wonder Denbigh Castle is said to still echo with these ghosts. But not all of these echoes are human, because local legend claims that here, in the shadow of this once great castle, a fire-breathing dragon was cut down in a fierce battle. What do you mean, dragons? I know, right, and we'll get to him. But the history of Denbigh Castle and where it got its ghosts doesn't actually start with the ruins that you can still see today. So Denbigh sits up in North Wales, in what was the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd. It's still now a county, but back then, full-on kingdom. And back in the 1200s, this area was basically a fault line between the English crown expanding west and the princes of Gwynedd, who were resisting against the invasion. All very tense. But long before the English even rocked up, there was already a Welsh fortress here in Denbigh, as it was the site of a royal court held by the princes of Gwynedd. The dynasty of Llywelyn ap Griffith, better known as Llywelyn the Last, and his brother Dafydd. So Denbigh wasn't just some random outpost, it was one of their seats of power, and so it was about to become super significant to King Edward I of England. In 1277, after King Edward's first war against Llywelyn, the English came out on top. Edward basically forced Llywelyn to give up huge chunks of land, and then handed Denbigh to Llywelyn's own brother, Dafydd. I know, but the thing was, Dafydd and Llywelyn weren't exactly the picture of brotherly love to begin with. Dafydd had switched sides before when it suited him, so King Edward saw an opportunity and pounced. And for a while, Dafydd played the part of loyal landowner to the English king until he didn't. Because just 5 years later, in 1282, being unhappy with how the English were running things in the lands around him, he flipped and launched a surprise attack on the English castle at Harden, which is about half an hour east of Denbigh. That kicked off Edward's second war in Wales, and it did not end well for the Welsh again. By the end of that year, Dafydd's brother Llywelyn ap Griffith was killed in battle. Just 6 months later, Dafydd himself was captured and executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered. And just like that, the battle for Welsh independence was pretty much crushed. After this war had been won, King Edward was not messing about. He went on a complete castle building spree across Wales, creating what's now called the Ring of Iron, designed to lock Wales under English control. Denbigh was going to form part of that Iron Ring, but while he had won the war, in Denbigh there was still one more battle to go, because the inhabitants of the fortress did not go gentle into that good night, and they actually held out for about a month against the English army, before eventually they were overrun, and Denbigh finally fell into King Edward's hands. Man, I'm just like throwing you straight into the drama this time. The castle that sits in ruins nowadays hasn't even been built yet, and there's already major conflict on this land. After taking Denbigh though, this time the king handed it over to one of his top pals, Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln. And he was the one that got started on the Denbigh Castle that we can see today. He wasted no time either, just got straight on with it as soon as he was let loose. By 1284, he'd cleared the old Welsh court that stood there originally, just completely scrubbed it from existence, and he started building a fortress that was likely designed by King Edward's castle architect, James of St. George. And just because the English had seized these lands again, didn't mean that de Lacy was going to just sit back and relax, build some cosy lord's manor or something. They still had military flexing to do. There was still a lot of tension, understandably, and so in the initial phase of construction, outer defences and towers were built for protection. They even slapped a brand new town onto the side of the fortress, wrapped in its own walls and locked tight to the castle. But this town, it was exclusively for English settlers. Just a very clear message, this land, now under new management. And then with the castle itself sitting on the hill like a giant "do not even think about it" sign to any Welsh who were fancying another rebellion to try and take back what was theirs. But it wasn't all just talk either. Denbigh was geared up for war. It could defend itself if it needed to. Murder holes and arrow slits in the gigantic gatehouse awaited you, and that was only if you'd managed to climb up the massive ditch nearly 10 metres wide. Basically, if you came to Denbigh to attack, you were gonna bleed. And plenty of people did, both attacking and defending it. Just like in September 1294, when the Welsh came back swinging. Denbigh Castle wasn't actually fully finished at that point though, it was still under construction, when Madog ap Llywelyn stormed in and took the castle by force. Yeah, they dragged Henry de Lacy's half-built fortress right out of his hands. And they didn't just target Denbigh. Madog's revolt lit up castles and towns across Wales. But Denbigh was one of the big prizes. Obviously, Henry tried to wrestle his castle back, marching into Denbigh to deal with it himself. But Madog's rebellion wasn't just some local scuffle, a few upset locals. It had spread across Wales. It was a huge national conflict. So despite Henry's efforts, the Welsh held Denbigh for months, until December, when King Edward himself had to step in and finish the job. Once it was clawed back into English control, Henry carried on building and developing, but he would never get to see the finished product that he had planned. He died in 1311, with the castle handed down to his daughter Alice and her husband Thomas, the second Earl of Lancaster. And Thomas carried on what his father-in-law had started, but he didn't hold on to it for long. He ended up executed for treason in 1322 after leading a failed rebellion against the English king at the time, Edward II. For a few decades after that, Denbigh Castle ping-ponged between different owners until in the spring of 1355 the Mortimer family, the Earls of March, took it on. And throughout the rest of that century they spent money repairing, maintaining and just improving the castle. Which just really goes to show how important this place was strategically. They were spending money on it. Because that strength and that ability to defend against attack, that was tested again in the 15th century, this time during the Wars of the Roses. And Denbigh Castle was still in the hands of the Mortimer family, who backed the Yorkists, the side which claimed that initially Richard, Duke of York, should be king until he was killed, and then his son Edward, he should have the throne instead. But the Lancastrians, the side that wanted Henry VI to wear the crown, they weren't having any of it. They wanted Denbigh Castle for themselves, and so they sent Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, and also conveniently King Henry's half-brother, to snatch it for their side. Yeah, mate, castle's yours, you just need to go and get it. Jasper tried twice to capture Denbigh, holding it for a couple of months in 1460 before losing it, and then again in 1468, but he got nowhere with that one, and so instead he burned down the town. Just full scorched earth, if I can't have it, then stuff the lot of you. And the people of the town, bless them, after suffering through attacks and sieges for the last 200 years, the townsfolk of Denbigh, who had just once again watched their homes burn down, they were a bit fed up after that. Because back when the place had first been built, the town had been a bit like an extra shield around the fortress. More walls and more bodies in the way. But the people of Denbigh, they just didn't want their houses or families used as cannon fodder anymore, and so they packed up and moved the town slightly away from the castle. And while, as time went on, the town got that little bit of distance, the castle itself started changing too. By the 1500s, it wasn't really the super strong military fortress that it had been built to be. It was crumbling in places, falling into a bit of decline. I think estate agents use the phrase "in need of modernisation." But that didn't mean that the castle was completely useless. Because in 1536, Denbigh Castle was given a new lease of life and a new role as the centre of county administration for Denbighshire. Literally turned it into council offices. The big old imposing gatehouse and looming towers weren't about defending against sieging armies anymore. They were a courthouse, a prison, and a place where justice was served, if you catch my drift. While Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne, the castle used to lock people up who were seen as traitors to the crown, especially anyone resisting her religious reforms. The most famous prisoner was Richard Gwyn, a Welsh poet and Catholic schoolmaster who, during a time when it was illegal to be a Catholic, kept teaching his faith in secret. As you can imagine, when he was found out to be doing this, it didn't go down well, and so he was imprisoned at Denbigh Castle from September 1581 to the spring of 1582. He was then transported away from Denbigh, and when it was time for his sentence to be carried out, in 1584 he was dragged off to Wrexham and executed. And afterwards, just to really hammer the point home, his head and one of his quarters, from being hanged, drawn and quartered, was stuck onto spikes and displayed at Denbigh Castle, which is Rather lovely to think about. But Denbigh's military days weren't completely behind it, because when the English Civil War broke out in 1642, which was the brutal clash between the monarchy, King Charles I, and Parliament, over which one of them was going to actually run the country, the castle was thrown right back into the thick of it. And I really mean into the thick of it. Denbigh was refortified, ready for what lay ahead. In September 1645, after his defeat at the Battle of Rowton Heath, King Charles I himself retreated here, staying 3 nights inside the castle walls to regroup. Just weeks after that, in November, hundreds of injured royalist soldiers poured back into Denbigh after another battle, where 100 men had died and 400 had been captured. But you can just imagine the atmosphere in the castle at this time. The place crammed with men fresh from the battlefield, some missing limbs, others with wounds already starting to fester. That smell of blood and sweat would have been absolutely choking. Exhausted men screaming and crying in pain, people hurrying to and fro, trying to do what they could for the wounded and the dying, trying not to trip over anyone. Because the soldiers would have been laid wherever there was space, on the stone floors, in corners, just propped up against walls. For most of them, the only treatment was amputation, a ragged bandage, or a prayer. And if infection set in, which it was pretty likely to, then that was it. But believe it or not, that was only the start of the nightmare for the royalists at Denbigh. Because in April 1646, the parliamentary forces launched a siege that lasted 6 months. They targeted one of the most significant towers, the one called the Goblin Tower. There's technically more part of the town walls rather than the tower within the castle, but basically it was built to protect a deep well that supplied the castle with water. And so the Roundheads, the parliamentarians, they were trying to bring it down and cut off that water supply. But the siege itself was vicious. That summer was said to be the hottest of the century. It was absolutely stifling. But also, hundreds of refugees had fled into Denbigh for safety from the parliamentarians after they'd attacked nearby towns, swelling the population inside the walls to nearly 1,700 people. The well inside the castle had pretty much dried up, and the one in the Goblin Tower was nearly gone too. With all of these people crammed inside so close together, plague had also broken out. By the start of May, the people begged the governor of Denbigh Castle, William Salisbury, to surrender. It became known as the Bumpkins Petition, basically saying, please, for the love of all that is good in this world, just surrender before we all die. Salisbury heard what they were saying, but just responded with, sorry, I gotta stay loyal to the king. By October though, the situation was getting even more dire, and after months of starvation and plague, William Salisbury wrote to the king, basically asking permission to surrender. Look, Your Majesty, this is the situation. I don't think we're going to last much longer, but also I don't want you to think I crossed you or anything like that. And so King Charles actually allowed Salisbury to yield the castle honourably. Although, here's a bit of a legend around the actual yielding. Apparently, Salisbury climbed to the top of the Goblin Tower and threw the keys to the castle down at the parliamentary forces below, shouting at them in Welsh, yours is the world, make a dunghill out of it. To have that level of sass after dealing with what I can only imagine was the most exhausting, expensive and stressful 6 months of your life. Just iconic. No, but that's just the story. It seems that the real way it went down was that the 500 cavaliers garrisoned there were able to just march out of the castle, head held high, everyone was a good sport about it. After Denbigh Castle was taken by the Roundheads, it was used as a prison for captured royalists for the rest of the war. But the story wasn't quite over there. In 1659, years after the war had officially ended, chaos erupted again. The royalists made one last desperate grab for power back from the parliamentarians, who were still running the country, and for a brief moment, they succeeded. Denbigh Castle was back under royalist control. It didn't really last very long, but it was enough for Parliament to say, right, no more, we're not taking any chances. And so in 1660, like so many other castles in Britain, Denbigh was slighted, which meant that it was deliberately wrecked so that it wouldn't be used as a military castle anymore. And after that, that was it. After centuries of fighting and bloodshed, Denbigh's military life was over. And from there, the decline was pretty severe, to be honest. Once Charles II was restored to the English throne, Denbigh and its once mighty town walls were effectively abandoned and left to ruin. Locals helped themselves to the stone for houses and farms, and the place just started to melt back into the landscape. And it wasn't actually until the mid-19th century that anyone stepped in to stop the decay. A castle committee was set up to preserve the ruins in the state that they were in at the time. So not to rebuild them or anything, just stop it from getting any further. And that is basically what we see today. Nowadays, Denbigh Castle is looked after by Cadw, Wales's Historic Environment Service, and is open to the public as a visitor attraction. You can look around what is left of the castle, plus the town walls, and it is absolutely fascinating. I will tell you what though, considering all the history and, let's face it, carnage that went down here, it's surprisingly quiet in terms of visitors. When we went, around this time actually last year, we were the only people there at one point. It's nothing like the crowds that you get at Conwy or Beaumaris. But just because it was quiet doesn't mean that we were completely alone. Because according to locals, staff, and seemingly a fair few terrified visitors, Denbigh Castle still has some lingering residents, shall we say. The most famous ghost at Denbigh Castle is the White Lady. Absolute classic, there is always a white lady, but this particular phantom is said to haunt the courtyard, and if you find yourself walking alone in the area on a murky, misty night, there's not another soul about, you might see the pale figure in a flowing white gown, gliding silently through the ruins. No one knows for sure who she is, but the most popular story says that she was a young widow. One day, her husband marched off to fight in one of the many battles that soldiers garrisoned at Denbigh Castle would have done over the centuries, but he never came home. And so this woman basically spent the rest of her life waiting for him on the castle walls. Eventually, she died of a broken heart, and now she's stuck at Denbigh Castle, wandering the grounds and still waiting. But there was another version of this story that I came across in one of the sources that say that she was trapped and left to die within the castle walls. Although, like I said, no reason as to why, what she did to deserve such a thing, anything like that. There was actually quite an infamous story from 1999 where 3 teenagers claimed to see this woman gliding down the castle towards them one night. Safe to say that they absolutely legged it on seeing this ghostly character heading straight towards them, but they were said to be so terrified that their encounter supposedly made the local papers. I couldn't find the article myself though, no names attached or anything like that, even after digging through the newspaper archives. So if you know where it is, please do let us know. And so something that's quite interesting at Denbigh Castle is that phantom cries have been heard throughout the castle too, as if a woman, somewhere you can't see, is absolutely distraught. And so you'd have thought, with a story as tragic as a husband going off to war and never coming back, it would be another manifestation of the White Lady, right? Apparently not. There's another woman said to haunt Denbigh Castle, but she's only ever heard and not seen. The story goes that this woman with an infant was getting water from the castle's well when the absolute unthinkable happened. And this part is pretty dark, forewarning you. See, even Lucy knows, and hence the fact he's come to be my emotional support animal. But somehow she dropped her baby and the baby fell into the well below. Whether she had them wrapped in a cloth carrier sling so she could go about her day with the baby and the cloth came loose, or what was going on, but oh my goodness, that guilt that woman would have been feeling would be indescribable. The story goes on to say that naturally she never recovered from it, and so now if you're walking around the ruins of Denbigh Castle alone, you can still hear her wailing as if she's desperately grieving her baby. God, you just can't even imagine it, can you? Just gonna take a second here, because even if we don't have the records to prove it, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And I mean, you can just feel that kind of heartbreak that she would have been feeling. That helpless, gut-wrenching moment of knowing what's happened and knowing that your life has just changed forever. You're never going to recover from that. So yeah, that story wasn't the nicest. That was a lot to drop on you. But I'm really sorry, we're not done with the sad ghost stories. And a lot of the ghostly reports surrounding Denbigh Castle seem to centre around the Goblin Tower, because this area is home to another ghost, and his story is also very sad, because people have reported for years catching sight of a boy's face staring out at them from one of the upper windows, not laughing, not playing, and certainly not living, as the floor is completely gone that he should be standing on, but he's just watching. Very pale face and just looking properly unsettling. Visitors say that the face appears for a few seconds, like he's peering out to see who's there, and then he vanishes without a trace. Some believe that he was the son of one of the castle builders who was constructing the tower. And this boy, he'd been climbing around the scaffolding, having a grand old time, as kids do, when he'd slipped and tragically fell to his death. Others say that it was no accident, and instead, this lad, being about 15 years old, had started seeing a local landowner's daughter on the down low, which would have been out of the question for a boy of his social status. And so he'd been thrown from the tower as punishment or to quietly get rid of him. But then there's another theory that says that it wasn't the builder's son at all, but instead it was the son of Henry de Lacy himself, the man behind Denbigh Castle. His son Edmund de Lacy had been the one to play on the scaffolding, and he'd been the one to slip and fall to his death into the well at the bottom of the tower. Again, we don't know for sure, but Edmund de Lacy did die young, so maybe. What's even worse is that Henry had another son, John de Lacy, who fell from a turret at Pontefract Castle and died too. Losing two sons though, in, let's face it, pretty similar, utterly tragic ways like that. How absolutely awful. But with that particular tower in Denbigh, if you're anything like me, you've got to be wondering, Goblin Tower. That name just doesn't appear out of thin air, right? I did a little bit of digging, but it doesn't seem like anyone's got a straight answer on where this name came from. One thing is for sure is that it definitely wasn't called that in Henry de Lacy's time, and historically it looks to have been referred to as the Bloody Tower, which is a whole other thing that suggests some sort of atrocities went down here anyway. So the name, the Goblin Tower, seems to have come about much later on, perhaps in the 19th century, when people just loved slapping creepy names onto old ruins. It could be because of the atmosphere of the place too. It's gloomy, it's echoey, and then there's the well at the bottom of the tower. It's the kind of spot where if anything strange was going to happen, you'd expect it to be here, you know? But that's not to say that the rest of the castle is dead quiet. Pardon the pun. If you believe the stories, basically the entire castle has this lingering energy about it, as if the walls have just soaked up those centuries of turmoil. Some people talk about standing in the castle courtyard alone when suddenly they hear the sounds of boots marching, but dozens of them all pacing in time on the ramparts of the castle, as if an army is still patrolling, but of course, there's never anyone there. And these supposedly are Cavalier Civil War soldiers, continuing to keep watch in case those parliamentarians come back. Other witnesses claim to actually see shadowy figures moving about in the courtyard, or see strange lights flickering from inside the empty towers, like someone's wandering around with a lantern. Again, never anyone there. A caretaker for the castle claimed that back in the 1960s, tools and artefacts that were displayed in the little museum kept on mysteriously moving around, with no explanation. But even more modern night security teams, they claim to hear doors slamming on their own and whispering in empty areas and faint laughter. Ooh, that's gonna be creepy. You're on your own late at night and you hear someone giggle when there shouldn't be anyone there? Nah, you're alright, thanks. There have been some paranormal teams who have investigated Denbigh Castle, and they seem to talk about the same things over and over again. There's this super heavy, oppressive atmosphere that doesn't lift until you're out of the castle entirely. And some investigators even claim to have been touched by something unseen. So yeah, walking around Denbigh Castle alone and someone taps you on the shoulder, that could be one of the ghostly residents checking in. But we cannot wrap up Denbigh's story without talking about the legend of the dragon. Yeah, a whole dragon. That's not clickbait. I know, I've been so excited to tell you about this one. But the legend goes that centuries ago, the area around Denbigh was terrorised by a massive fire-breathing beast. But this thing would fly over the town of Denbigh, searching for children that it could snatch, or livestock that it could attack, or any way that it could just generally make life an absolute nightmare for the locals. But its lair was Denbigh Castle. Eventually, the townsfolk were so over the whole living in fear every day, and so they called on the local nobleman called Sir John of the Thumbs, which is a very interesting name, but it was because the man supposedly had 8 fingers and 2 thumbs on each hand. The numbers vary depending on which version you come across, but the point is this guy had more than the average amount of fingers and thumbs. You say John is going to go and slay the dragon. Which John is it? It's the Middle Ages. We're all called John. John, you know exactly the guy. John with the thumbs. Oh, John with the thumbs. Know exactly who you're on about now. According to the legend, he rode up to the castle ready for a fight, and the dragon was so outraged that someone had dared to stand up to it that the ensuing battle was epic. Sir John narrowly managed to avoid streams of fire and razor-sharp claws, and he drew his broadsword ready to attack. But at that moment, the dragon caught sight of Sir John's hands, and apparently that was what stunned the beast. The dragon was said to be totally confused. Human, do you know you have extra extra digits. And in that moment of hesitation, Sir John saw his opportunity. He'd noticed that the dragon had little patches of soft, unprotected skin underneath its wings without any scales, and so he plunged his sword into that soft, fleshy spot. The dragon let out one final blood-curdling scream before it fell silent. Sir John chopped off its head and carried it back to the townspeople, who all started shouting Denbigh, which apparently meant no more dragon. And so, supposedly, that's where Denbigh gets its name. Denbigh, you can't, yeah, okay, I can see it. With dragon legends though, it always just makes me wonder a little bit whenever I see a story about a man defeating a dragon, because you see them all over, don't you? And it makes you wonder where they all came from. I asked myself that while I was doing the research for this one, going down all the different rabbit holes while I'm procrastinating, as one does. Apparently, it might have had something to do with the fact that people centuries ago would come across fossils or even bones of ancient mammals like mammoths and things, and then the myths and legends would just spiral from there. Some farmer finds a mammoth skull in his field, ends up down the tavern telling his mates how he defeated a dragon. What do you mean you don't believe me? I've got the skull right here to prove it. Or maybe dragons did roam this land. Anyway, perhaps someone who actually speaks Welsh anyway can enlighten us all in the comments too, but from what I can see, the translation part doesn't make sense either. No more dragon translates to dim dreg moi. Besides the fact that other sources say that the name Denbigh comes from Denbigh, meaning little fortress, which realistically speaking seems very fitting, with the stone fortification that stood watch over the town for centuries. But while the remaining ruins of Denbigh Castle are now a place to learn about the history and quietly contemplate the thousands of lives that were lived and ended in this area, it's not hard to imagine the things that these walls may have seen. Clashing armies, desperate prisoners, grieving mothers, but maybe those things aren't all in your imagination. And so, after everything that this place has witnessed, do you think that Denbigh Castle could be haunted? Have you ever visited and experienced something a little bit strange yourself? Tell me all of the things in the comments, and feel free to roast me about my Welsh pronunciation. I know it's terrible. The recording for this video took twice as long because of the amount of times that I got the pronunciation wrong and had to go back and retry. But to be honest, I was a little bit concerned when I started the research for this one. I did wonder whether there was going to be enough to tell you about. I should have known better though, really. This one was heavy on the history, but if my comment sections are anything to go by, you love that just as much as me, so we're all good. For a place that I don't really see many people mention though, this was so fascinating to look into. I would highly recommend visiting too, especially if you're going to make the trip to try and catch a glimpse of what remains of Denbigh Mental Hospital, where we spoke about last week. The castle is literally just right up the hill. Go and have a wander around, and if you climb the steps up the towers, you'll get a reasonably good view of the old hospital anyway. As for whether I think it's haunted, with everything that has gone down here over the centuries, the sieges, the executions, heartbreak, all of that, plus the castle before the one that's still kind of standing there now. If anywhere is going to hang on to that kind of energy, it's going to be here. But I don't know, to me, it feels more residual, like echoes. The grieving mother, the waiting wife, the boy's tragic fall. It's more like those stories and that energy is imprinted on the place itself rather than something actively stalking the grounds. Because, being ruthlessly honest for a minute, the ghosts seem to be more of those properly classic ghost stories, don't they? You could literally copy and paste them into almost any medieval castle in the country and they would fit. It's all just people say and the story goes, rather than, oh, Mr. and Mrs. Smith saw this very specific description of a ghost on the 26th of April 2004 kind of report. But I guess that's all just part of the charm, isn't it? You can't have a castle without a ghostly lady in white. And it's not to say that they aren't there. I would just love to see more specific reports come out from that place. But that's what I think. Let me know your thoughts. On a more personal note, last week the channel turned 2 years old, which is wild to think about. So first of all, thank you to every single one of you who has ever interacted, commented, liked, shared, subscribed, all of the things, even just watched my videos. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. But being in that kind of reflective mood and doing the research for this one, it got me thinking about how doing the research for all of these different videos and things over the last couple of years has been brilliant for piecing together my understanding of UK history. Because the more places I cover, the more names and events start clicking together like this big ghost-filled jigsaw puzzle that's covered in blood. But I'll see a name pop up in some record and I'll be like, oh, it's you again, stirring the pot as always, aren't you, mate? fingers in loads of pies. I don't know if you get the same impression if you've watched a lot of my content, but yeah, this channel has taught me more about history than school ever did. They should add haunted history to the curriculum. I think students might pay attention then. Maybe. I don't know. But on that note, if you enjoyed this one, please do let me know by liking the video and hyping it too if you're on your mobile. Just swipe across on the comments box and you should see the hype button hiding there. And it really does mean the world to me. I had a few new people find the channel through the hype leaderboard the other week, so that was a lovely surprise that I owe to you lovely lot. And if you want to see more like this and you're not already, please do subscribe to the channel. I'd love to have you back for more ghost stories wrapped up in history lessons that you didn't know you wanted. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water. Please stay hydrated. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that you're not trapped in a medieval castle under an utterly terrifying siege with the well running dry, so topping up your glass should be a lot easier. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. The dynasty of here we go. Llywelyn ap Griffith. I can't say words normally, let alone Welsh words. Llywelyn ap Griffith. Llywelyn ap Griffith. The dynasty of Llywelyn ap Griffith. Hell.